The Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County is partnering with the Tri-City Interfaith Council to be able to put on 3 community conversations and 3 different programs that we in Contra Costa have been offering for the last 3 years. Defusing Hatred, which has been recorded and is now on YouTube. Everyday Peacemaking, also on our YouTube channel. And tonight we'll be going through Courageous Conversations. And of course, we are the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County working together with the Tri-City Interfaith Council tonight. So this is what we've done. And the recordings for the first 2 are up on our YouTube channel. And as whenever we come together, we also recognize that we are on native lands, and wherever you may work or live or play, we remember that Tuishtak was a sacred land. The Sigoriate shore in Vallejo was a sacred spot. The Shell Mountain in Berkeley and Emeryville were sacred land cemeteries and places for rituals of our friends in all of the different Ohlone and Bay Miwok, coastal Miwok, Karkin, and Patwin tribes. And most of them live here among us despite the California indigenous genocide. So tonight we're going to be doing the 3rd of our 3 programs, the Courageous Conversations, and really trying to go a little deeper as we do so, and really going and looking at our own perspective as well as the perspective of others. And tonight really is about listening with compassion. And of course, as we do so, we attempt to remember a bit of the practices that we've learned already, as practice makes perfect. So just as a brief overview, I'll just share that in the Defusing Hatred program, we talked about and gave an introduction to nonviolent communication, which it gives skills to be able to deepen conversation, especially going beyond just observation, going into feelings and needs, so that when we make requests of each other, it can be free of demands to be able to honor the free will of the others that we may be in conversation with. And of course, we live in a very diverse world and increasingly diverse and increasingly divided, and sometimes even people in their own families living in different media worlds and social media worlds. We also heard a little bit about an interfaith approach to defusing hatred, and that was from Father Tom Bonacci in the Interfaith Peace Project. He's a member of our governing board. We always encourage congregations to invite him to come speak. In fact, he'll be speaking at my congregation on September 19th on the International Day of Peace. But he encourages these kinds of questions. What do you truly believe? Especially understanding that oftentimes when we hear this, we often give the Sunday school answers or the answers that our religious leaders may give instead of the answer of what we truly believe. And have we met people that we have strong feelings or judgments for or against? And are we willing to meet people about whom we have strong feelings or judgments? And if so, why and why not? And being clear with ourselves, because it's important for people to meet people who they believe differ from them, so that we can humanize issues and separate issues from people, because behind every issue, there's a real life human being worthy of respect and understanding. And then of course, we spent some time thinking about how to interrupt harassment when we see it in the public sphere, and went through a bit of that, reminding ourselves of this call from the Talmud based on Micah 6:8 to not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. We can do justly now, we can love mercy now, we can walk humbly now. We're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are we free to abandon it. And of course, our last program was called Everyday Peacemaking, and that was going a little bit deeper beyond the Defusing Hatred program, remembering that despite our news media pretending that there's 2 sides to every issue, there really is 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 sides to every issue. So how do we build a culture that expects diversity, and recognizing the role of stress in our own lives? How do we control our own anger when it gets in the way of good communication? How do we control our own fear? How do we respond directly to another who has no intention of listening or even acknowledging our existence? How do we, how does feeling in control serve to decrease our fear? And this amazing new finding from Taylor Clark in the book Nerve, Poise Under Pressure, serenity under stress, and the brave new science of fear and cool, that the more certainty and control we think we have about a potentially threatening situation, the less stress we will feel. Interestingly enough, perception is all that counts with this. You don't actually need to have perfect certainty or total control over how things will pan out. You just need to believe that you have them, and that can help us be calm under pressure. But also recognizing that we all have unlearned bias and confirmation bias, and that we all need to do our own work, because each of our life has been and experiences have been very different. And that our spiritual practices give us part of the tools that we need to be able to calm our hearts and minds, reconnect with nature or the holy, and recognize that we are a part of something way bigger than just ourselves. So that's a brief overview of what we went through in the two previous curriculums. For this one tonight, we're going to get started with a story by about FDR at a White House reception. It said that he got tired of smiling at one of these black tie events and all of the usual words, and he wanted to test if people were really listening to him. So to each person, he said, "I murdered my grandma this morning." People automatically responded, "How lovely, great reception, great, continue your great work, nice to see you." Nobody listened except one diplomat who responded softly, "I'm sure she had it coming to her." How often do we go through life with such conversations missed? I know I miss a lot, especially as my hearing gets a little harder in older age. But Thich Nhat Hanh has a great saying about this, especially these 3 steps to peace that he teaches in this outline. First, listen to the suffering of all sides. Second, relate the sufferings of all sides to one another. And third, bring all sides together so that they may hear one another. Love this quote from Mary Ann Rodmacher: "Courage does not always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow." Let's watch this video, an interview with Thich Nhat Hanh.
You refer to, I can't remember which book, but you talk about deep listening also.
Deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of the other person. We can call it compassionate listening. You listen with only one purpose: help him or her to empty his heart. And if you remember that you are helping him or her to suffer less, and then even if he say things full of wrong perceptions, full of bitterness, you are still capable to continue to listen with compassion. Because you know that listening like that, with compassion, you give him or her a chance to suffer less. If you want to help him or her to correct his perception, and then you wait for another time, but for the time being, you just listen with compassion and help him or her to suffer less. And 1 hour like that can bring transformation and healing.
So I love this idea of deep listening, because oftentimes when someone comes to you and they want to really vent, they want to purge whatever is going on inside them, people start talking and giving advice. So if you allow the person just to let whatever those feelings are to come out, and then at another time come back to them with your advice or your comments, you would experience a deeper healing. That's what you're saying.
Yes, the fear, the anger, and the despair is born on the ground of wrong perception. And we have wrong perceptions concerning ourselves and the other person. And that is the foundation for conflict and war and violence.
You've said that the only way we can begin to end war is due to communication between people.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And we should be able to say like this: dear friends, dear people, I know that you suffer a lot. I have not understood enough of your difficulties and suffering. It's not our intention to make you suffer more. It is the opposite. So please tell us about your suffering, your difficulties. I'm eager to learn, to understand. It has to start like that, loving speech. And if we are honest, if we are true, they will open their heart and tell us. And then we practice compassionate, deep listening. And during the process of deep listening, we can learn so much about our own perception and their perceptions. And that is the best way, the only way to remove terrorism.
Terrorism or even difficulties between yourself and
Yes.
family members or friends.
Yes.
And the principle is the same no matter the conflict.
Yes.
Terrorists, anti-terrorists,
Yes.
father and son,
Right.
yourself and your boss,
Right.
yourself and your children, your best friend.
Yes.
Oprah gets the best interviews. So going about deeper about the Compassionate Listening Project, Cynthia Moore gave this quote: "Compassionate listening directs itself not toward finding just resolution of conflict, but toward reconciliation of those involved, trusting that they will find their own or will initiate a process toward resolution and justice." Of course, good mediation involves compassionate listening. The main difference is that compassionate listening, capitalized as a practice, is not directed toward an outcome beyond reconciliation. We go into compassionate listening with the understanding that true lasting resolution is built on a foundation of mutual understanding, respect, and love. And it can be very hard. We're going to dive deeper into this TED Talk that is very powerful. So let's hold each other as we hear this story together.
It was spring, 1994, in Montreal. I was in my office when the phone rang. It was the Israeli consulate. My brother Ari had just been killed in a suicide bus bombing. He was 19 and a paratrooper in the Israeli army. The consulate reserved a seat for me on a flight to Tel Aviv. It was leaving in 4 hours, and I had to get to the airport right away. Upon landing in Tel Aviv, an army jeep came right up to the plane. Soldiers came on board. "Tali, we're here to take you to your parents' home." No customs, no security. I just walked down the stairs and got into the jeep. We began the 4-hour drive to the desert. I was numb. My mind wandered back to when I was 13. Another senseless murder, another army jeep. That army jeep came out of nowhere, dust trailing behind. It pulled up to our home. I just knew it was something bad. The army officer jumped out and shouted, "Where is your father? Do you know the Bedouins?" "Yes, of course I know the Bedouins." He continued, "Last night, while out in the desert, one of the Bedouin children was murdered. We need you to identify the body." It was my friend Awad. We had grown up together, riding camels, baking pita, and his family tent was really my second home. But now Awad was gone. Awad's mother, Fraja, was in shock. She was such an amazing woman, so warm and kind. She had this twinkle in her eye. We were really close. And she would say to me, "Tali, ana bahebki," I love you. But now, she was so sad, and she seemed so small, sitting in her tent on the earth floor. I held her as she swayed back and forth, sobbing, "Awad, Awad." My thoughts brought me back to the present. Here I was, 15 years later, facing my brother Ari's death. We arrived at the kibbutz where my parents lived, and the first person I saw was Fraja. She had heard that I was coming. It was so surreal seeing her walk out from the dark desert night into the light of the kibbutz. I just lost it. I collapsed into her arms, we cried, and we held each other. I walked up to my parents' home. I couldn't believe Ari was gone. I had just seen him the summer before, and it was the first time in 10 years we were finally connecting. Before that, I had been estranged from my parents and, by association, my younger siblings. I found my mother in the living room. She was just sitting there, staring down, crying, not able to talk. She seemed so sad and so fragile, she reminded me of Fraja. I tried to hold her, but there was no response, so I just sat down. Everyone was in shock. There was so much crying and talking and deep sadness. Lots of people were coming and going, and the sound of the screen door flying open and slamming shut, and food. There was lots of food, but lots of anger too. People were saying things like, "The army must strike back. The Palestinians should all be kicked out. Send them to Jordan. This is not their land. This land was given to us by God." A few days later, when my mother started to speak, she kept repeating, "The Palestinians killed Ari. They're the enemy. They don't want peace." I didn't see it that way. My best friend, Awad, was Palestinian, and so was his family. But so was the suicide bomber that killed my brother. I realized there was so much anger between both sides, Israelis and Palestinians. How did we get to this point? And how do we begin to diffuse the anger? I discovered the Montreal Dialogue Group, where Jews and Arabs got together every month to talk. Now, the first time I walked in, there was this person yelling at the top of his voice with lots of hand gestures. This was not what I was expecting from a dialogue group. But I did go back, and there was more arguing and more yelling. But there was also a framework to help us get back on track. And people were sharing personal stories, things like loss, suffering, and pain. And afterwards, there was food, always food, to help people come together, relax, mingle, and make plans to come back next month for, you may have guessed it, more arguing and more food. There was one person in the group that I got along with really well, Ihab. He was always respectful and very knowledgeable about both sides of the conflict. He was funny too. I felt this strong connection. We started dating, and 2 years later, we got married. But then, my mother found out. "What? You married an Arab? A Palestinian activist yet? What were you thinking? What's wrong with you?" She stopped speaking to me. How is this possible? I had been working on my communication skills for the past 2 years. Clearly, I needed better tools. Soon after, I came across the Compassionate Listening Project. Maybe this would help me reconnect with my mother. Compassionate listening is all about deep listening. Normally, in a conversation, we hear the other person, but we don't always listen. We're too busy thinking about how we're going to respond. Compassionate listening is taught through these specific exercises. We learn to listen from a place of empathy while putting our biases and judgments on the side. Why is that so important? Because at the end of the day, we all want to be understood. We all want to share our side of the story. And so, the hard part is not to get triggered when listening to someone we disagree with. We have this tendency to want to jump in and argue. In compassionate listening, we learn to recognize those triggers as soon as they start. We say to ourselves, this isn't about me at the moment. This is all about the speaker. What are they saying? What are they feeling? The listener actually stays neutral. We keep neutral facial expressions. We put all our focus on the speaker's feelings, not on our own. Now, that's the listener. What about the speaker? The speaker learns to get to the essence of their story instead of rehashing all the details. And when we get to the essence, things can begin to shift. We might discover something new about ourselves. We may even find answers to our own questions. I immersed myself in compassionate listening. I started my own dialogue group. The question was, what about my mother? Was I ready to try this with her? And would it even work? I had continued to call her once a month, and once a month she'd pick up and say very little. But I refused to give up, and I believe that's what Ari would have wanted. He had said to me, Tali, I can see you want to bring the family back together to create shlom bayit, family peace. That was the last time I saw him. It was 6 years into my marriage. I felt the time was right, so I phoned up my mother and I said, Mom, there's something I'd like to try with you. It's called compassionate listening. On the other end, I promise to listen to anything you want to say. I won't interrupt, I won't argue. She was skeptical, but eventually she agreed. And that conversation, oh my goodness, it was tense. She unleashed all her anger. I'm mad that you married an Arab and you disrespected Ari's memory. It was hard for me not to react. I clearly was triggered, but I maintained the course. And her anger turned to sadness and eventually a willingness to hear my side of the story. I felt such relief and such joy that finally my mother felt safe enough to have a relationship with me. After that, we phoned regularly. I visit her every year, and we now have a good relationship based on true dialogue. She even said to me once, you know, Tali, you're the one person I can really talk to because I know you're just going to listen. I feel safe. She even started introducing me differently. Before it was, this is Tali, and now, this is Tali, my daughter, the peacemaker. I continue to use compassionate listening in my daily life, but it requires constant vigilance to keep the heart open, acknowledging the other, creating that space for the other person to open their heart and begin to acknowledge us in return. When we hit an impasse, relating compassionately can literally change the conversation. And it is this human connection that can indeed create meaningful change. Thank you.
So the Compassionate Listening Project is more than the spiritual practice that Thich Nhat Hanh talked about. It's also an actual project around the world that's used to teach these skills. And it really is a way to hear more deeply, but you do need to set some ground rules in order to do that. And if you go into it knowing that it's not about changing minds and really about our ability to really hear others, and when you're the one speaking to be heard by others, then I think we can get what we're going after here. Now, there's a few don'ts in compassionate listening. As well as you can, please try to work against interruptions, advice, judgmental questions, or any barriers to true listening, because we're trying to create this context of friendship where the listener relates a similar story, can both help you feel heard, but could also feel dismissive as though you've lost the stage. So this isn't about one-upping or anything like that. It's really just about hearing and listening for understanding, not towards responding. So it's a formal listening. Recounting that reminds me of kinds of stories aren't helpful as well. And here are some of the do's. The do's are sometimes harder, especially in cross-cultural communication. In general, it's important to learn enough about the other culture to avoid being rude, and it's also important not to worry too much with or without culture as a factor. And some people find that nods and eye contact help them feel heard, and others find this body language distracting and prefer to be listened to by someone who's very still. So if you know that you're in a time, or if you can tell that someone's reacting, you might just try the opposite response. If it's too much to be looked at or to be nodded at, then you might just try to be more still for them. There are other groups that try to encourage some boundaries around hard conversations like that. This evangelical group called the Global Immersion Project that has some members in Walnut Creek say these are the top 10 that they use. Recognize the opportunity of differences, listen longer than feels comfortable, lead with curiosity rather than critique, embrace our shared identity, enter into the conversation as the student and not an expert, share stories rather than data points. Staying at the table does not mean you're not allowed to take a break. Are you operating out of a place of grace or a place of shame? Share what you're learning rather than what you think they should know. Using I statements when you do have conversations. And don't forget that it's in the process of pursuing restoration that we find ourselves being restored. And of course, the 4 agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, being impeccable with our word, not taking things personally, not making assumptions, and always doing our best is good advice as well. And as we remembered in our last meeting, what we're trying to do is getting beyond surface relationships and really opening ourselves to others' worldviews instead of attempting to will people over to our views. And to do that, we do have to recognize our own confirmation bias and what lenses we see the world through. And the more we can be honest with that, the more we can suspend judgment and hold the tension. And one other way that we mentioned last time was a mantra you could use. If it helps you, great. If it doesn't, let it go. But you could say silently to yourself, would you be willing to show me the world through your eyes? That's the kind of posture we're looking for. And we know that there are stories out there of lots of different really hard conversations, whether it's gun violence or immigration and the treatment of children at the border, and especially the race relations that we've been doing so much talk about these days. But one little stream that I'd like to share with you that might be helpful for others in the faith community to understand, especially because there's so much about it, is what is life like for transgender people? And one of my friends is the Reverend Aaron Swenson, who was the first Presbyterian minister to transition from male to female. They're in retirement right now. They've done a lot of work with the Human Rights Campaign. But Aaron came and spent a whole day with us as seminarians during my time in seminary and helped me understand what had only been something that I'd never really even knew existed very much. And that the genetics and the distribution and the diversity of transgender people is truly amazing. These are all people with XXY gender chromosomes, and they can express themselves in varying different ways. And when we understand that this is a part of the human diversity, and that sometimes it even happens inside the womb and other times it happens outside the wombs, that we can understand that this isn't a choice that some folks that try to make this a political issue, that we can understand it outside of a political realm, and it really is a part of the diversity of the human family. And so it's important when meeting a transgender person to ask them or invite them to tell us what pronouns they would prefer that we would use for them, so that we can use language that's really honoring. And for the faith community, this is a really important issue, because a lot of the folks, and if we don't have gender expansive restrooms, bathrooms are one of the places a lot of transgender people either feel like they're going to get yelled at if they don't match what other people view that they should look like in order to be in this one of the very last gender segregated spaces in our society, or beat up in the other one. And we know that there's lots of discrimination even in the workplace against transgender people. And among the uglier aspects is that there's lots of suicide among transgender people. 41% of respondents reported attempted suicide compared to 1.6 in the general population. So we know that life isn't easy for these folks. And in fact, other statistics point an even bleaker picture, that 29% of trans people live in poverty, 30% have been homeless, 40% have attempted suicide, 33% have experienced discrimination in healthcare, 30% in workplace discrimination, 47% have experienced sexual assault. And then being trans and another marginalized identity, like being a person of color, having a disability, being undocumented, brings additional discrimination, compound discrimination, especially Black trans women, who are the most murdered population in our country. 32% less than they did pre-transition. So even their ability to make money, even if they, especially if they move from a male to a female, they start losing out on some of their earning potential. Transgender men make 1.5% more after transitioning than they did, but Latino trans men make 54 cents on the dollar, and white transgender men 79 cents on the dollar. And if we just knew this about transgender, what not to ask or what to say to trans folks in order to be honoring, these would be some of the things that just knowing this would give us enough cultural competency that we would know how to treat them in ways that are honorable. So these are questions that they would rather not have us ask them. What is your birth name? Can I see a picture of you from before? Have you had the surgery? I never would have known that you were trans. And if you're not sure, if a question is too personal, do err on the side of caution. And there's some really good things on the website that point out words and phrases that are transphobic and why. And if you want to get to know a lot of these differing ways that people feel discriminated against in the trans community, it's good to go a little deeper in this as well. There are some groups out there that are doing really good work, like the Family Acceptance Project, which is helping families do their work if they are struggling accepting their gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, trans, intersex, two-spirit, or other child that might be coming out to them. If they know that they're going to have a hard time accepting that as a person of faith, the Family Acceptance Project has some resources for you, but it also encourages you to do your faith work separate, so that, because we know just how much discrimination such folks receive, and to receive that from family members is even harder. So being able to go do your work separately and express acceptance to them, actually it decreases their suicidal ideation substantially. I love this quote from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So we're going to go into some courageous conversations. We're going to practice listening and being vulnerable ourselves. And a part of this is recognizing that we can only really love specific people in their own situations with their particular needs. So we're doing this practice as a way of being present for those that we're listening to. So what we're going to ask you to do, and we're going to have one person, we'll have 5 different people share a story tonight, and we're going to ask you to just listen to the short 3 to 5 minute story. Practice listening to understand, not to respond. In fact, if you find yourself even going towards a to-do list or thinking of a list of things that you'd like to ask this person about their story or trying to fix it for them, just use a sacred word like contemplative prayer to just redirect your attention back to the person who's speaking. And then in between each of the stories being told, we're just going to put 2 to 3 minutes of silence in between the stories. And then I'm going to just give a little message to the person in the chat room that we're ready to go. And so while we're doing this, see if you can keep from thinking of responses or questions. Just try to stay in the moment. Hold the storyteller and their story in your hearts and minds. That's what we're after right now. So we're back in our group, and Reverend Barbara Myers is going to give us our first story. So we're gonna, there you go.
Hey.
It's all yours.
So I'm involved with a group called Sidewalk Talk. It is an organization that basically has you sit in chairs on sidewalk out in the general public, and with a sign that says free listening here today. And you talk to whoever comes by, and whatever they want to say, you let them talk and you listen. And I have been doing this for a number of years, and I chose to start this listening project in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, which is a very poor neighborhood. So one day,
Uh-oh, Barbara, I'm afraid you froze, at least on my end, and my end is doing the recording. So, Barbara, are you unstuck? We're not able to hear you yet, Barbara. So I think Barbara might have to jump out and jump back in. So we're going to get her story here. So Jessica, if you don't mind, let's just have about 30 seconds of silence.
okay.
Oh, are you back, Barbara?
I think. Yes.
Okay.
I don't know what happened.
You froze a little bit before that, so you'll have to back up. I think you had just introduced the listening
Okay.
and where you were doing it in the Tenderloin.
Right. So I do this with a partner, and sometimes we have other listeners that come and listen with us. And there was one day that I was in the sidewalk, and we had this sign in front of us that said free listening here today. And this man came by and sat down. And he said, I just, more than anything, I just want to have a job. I want to have a place to live, and I want to have somebody to live with. And I don't have any of those. I'm unemployed. I can't get a job because I have a incarceration in my past, and they won't hire me because I have a record. And I'm homeless. I don't have any place to stay. Don't know where I'll be staying tonight. And I don't have anybody that wants to be with me. Maybe I should go and jump off the bridge. And at that point, I was thinking to myself, how am I going to respond? Or what can I do to let him know that I've heard what he has to say and that I feel him with compassion? And I know it, Will, when we talked about this before, I can tell you what it was that I did, but I think you told me this, leave it hanging there. So I'll leave it hanging there for right now.
We'll have you share later in our time.
Okay.
So we're going to have 2.5 minutes of silence as we just hold this story in our heart. Okay. Next, we're going to hear from Jessica Sterling from the Jewish Community Relations Council.
Thank you, Reverend Will, for the opportunity to share a personal story. This one's about anti-Semitism. I'm the parent of a Jewish American teen, and my youngest daughter attends a public school in Oakland, and she's a good student, and she has a small, solid group of friends. Her religious schooling spanned from the ages from preschool through 7th grade. She's not religious, but she definitely identifies as a Jew culturally. Like many teens, my daughter is active on social media, and from what I hear a lot of teens spend time on screen in apps like TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter. And she sits on the couch and she flips through the videos, scrolling up with her thumb, stopping occasionally to read comments and maybe hit like or write a short comment of her own. For the past 18 months, my daughter has spent considerably more time viewing videos and reading the comments than ever before the pandemic. And I want to share a side note on that during the pandemic, there's been a noticeable and trackable increase in anti-Semitism online, both in the United States and abroad. Domestic reports are tracking anti-Semitism rates rising 10% during the pandemic over the previous year. And I read a report that in Europe, there's been a 7-fold rise in anti-Semitism online in France and a 13-fold increase in Germany. And this is a worldwide phenomenon fueled by conspiracy theories about Jews ruling international financial, political, media institutions, as well as Holocaust deniers. So my daughter had begun to see anti-Semitism within the comments section on social media platforms, as well as just outright anti-Semitic videos. And when I asked how she feels about it, she replies that all racial and religious groups are attacked online, not just Jews. And it really just makes me feel sad for the kids. In a forum that could be creative and bring joy, there's just some destruction and hate. Now, I know it's not all destruction and hate, but still, there is a lot of it. So what am I supposed to say to her? How do I make things right and fix this bigotry, which, like a California wildfire, has spread to all corners of the internet? I'm wondering if you're experiencing this as a parent. I wonder to myself, what can I do to help my daughter through this time? These past 18 months have been isolating for so many kids, and going back to school in person, which she did last week, can create mixed emotions. The excitement to see old friends, as well as holding anxieties and fears of contracting COVID. And to add the stress of anti-Semitism or any bigotry is a burden that some may not be able to hold. The best I can offer now is to talk through the issues. The comments she reads online are not personal attacks, but they sometimes hurt as much. Does avoiding the apps make the anti-Semitism go away? How else will anti-Semitism show up for teens? My daughter's resilient. She has a good sense of self and a confidence as a high school junior that maybe wasn't there 2 years ago as a new freshman on campus. By the end of the first week of in-person school, I noticed that my daughter was wearing her Star of David necklace. During dinner, I asked how school was, and she gave me a thumbs up. And I just want to end by saying that we in the Jewish community have seen this uptick in anti-Semitism as a trend for middle and high school students recently. There is support and there are resources to help. And I want to share that JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council, has just begun an online campaign which brings allies front and center called Here I Am. It includes stories from Jews and allies of Jews, which are starting to be added and can be found at hereiamstories.org. Thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll hold some time in silence again. And then we're going to hear from Joy. Take a big deep breath with me and let it out with a little noise. We're going to do 3 of these. And if you hiss at the end, you can let even more air out of your lungs. Another big deep breath in. Letting it out with a little noise. Maybe let your shoulders go a little looser this time. Ooh. One more big deep breath in. Letting it out with a little noise. Joy, please go and share your story with us, and we will try our best again to stay with you in the moment.
A number of years ago, I had a deaf colleague who could read lips and speak with sign language. But obviously she did not have eyes in the back of her head. And the two of us were walking towards the elevator one day, and someone came up behind us in a scooter. And I happened to know this person and know that he could be somewhat aggressive. So I was not surprised that he was beeping and making beeping noises and sounding very frustrated. I was standing there in this situation, not really knowing what to do.
Returning to our group silence. Listening for when our own attention is trying to take us elsewhere. Use a sacred word or something to bring your attention back to the present moment and back to the story itself. Taking one more big deep breath. Letting it out with a little noise as we just recognize. Not even trying to think of what we would do in that moment, but thinking what joy might do in that moment. It's so hard, because so often when we hear stories like this, we think of what we might do. Cheryl's going to give us our next story, and then we're going to take a little bit more of an extended break, and I'm going to share a brief end to the presentation, and then we're going to have a group dialogue about the process. Thank you, Cheryl.
Well, thank you, Reverend Will. I tend to be very active in my community for a long time, and I've been a Sunday school teacher. I enjoy children a lot, so I relate to little kids everywhere I go. And one day I was standing in a line at the ATM at the grocery store, and a little boy about 6 was standing with his father, a large burly man with tattoos all over. And the boy looked up at me, but I couldn't smile at him because I had my mask on, so he couldn't tell I was smiling at him. But eventually, in curiosity and boredom, he turned around and moved on to watch what his dad was doing at pushing the ATM buttons. And the father immediately started screaming at the boy, telling him to get away from him, to stand over there, and don't ever do that again, and kind of pushed him off into another aisle. And it was all in a booming voice that actually shook me. Normally, my interjection might be connecting with the child in some way, like facial expressions, which I couldn't do, or small talk, like, are you learning computers yet? Or something like that, referring to watching his dad do pushing of buttons. That's when I noticed that from standing behind this man, that his arms all on the back were very prevalent tattoos of swastikas and SS markings. And at that point, I realized that the man might actually be a violent man. He might be abusive. And I felt glued to the floor. His anger translated to something completely different than it did before, as just another parent being pushed at the moment. So I was afraid to speak to the child after, I was afraid of being rebuffed in some extremely hostile way. My mind was racing for options, but nothing came. I did nothing, and I felt enormous failure when they moved on, because I had not reacted, not taken care of anything. And I went away from that situation with the whole thing haunting me for days. Do I abandon my values or risk my safety? And I went away from that situation wondering if my indecision added to the risk of the child long term. There were just so many conflicting things that traumatized me.
Stories mean so much to us. And they should, since our scriptures are full of the stories that mean so much to us. I don't know where this quote comes from. If you know, you can share it with me. But it's, in the intimacy of human vulnerability shared, love is born. A few years ago, people would wear safety pins as a way of sharing with someone that they were prepared to be there for them, to be a safe person for them, to listen, to hold, to stand up, to sit down, to shut up, to do what I can to let you know that regardless of who you are, I'm here, and this is a sign that you'll know me. What we experienced a bit is holding space for one another, and I want to go a little deeper with this short video, and to think a little bit more about what holding space and how important holding space is for each of us. That's a great article, uplift.com. And nothing is as strong as gentleness, nothing as gentle as real strength, as St. Francis de Sales said. So why don't we, I taught a little bit about holding space in my own community, and we did a litany with it. What does it mean to hold space for someone else? Barbara, would you mind reading the one for this?
It means that we are willing to walk alongside another person in whatever journey they're on without judging them. When we hold space for other people, we open our hearts, offer unconditional support, and let go of judgment and control.
And Bev, would you read the one on this? Holding space helps to create a container for complex emotions such as fear, grief, trauma, and joy.
When people feel that they are held in a deeper way than they are used to, they may feel safe enough to allow complex emotions to surface that might normally remain hidden. As we become more practiced at holding space, we are more able to hold it in a gentle, supportive, and non-judgmental way.
And Jessica? Holding space allows us to recognize that in our diversity, people have a range of experiences that may be different than our own.
Holding space is about respecting each person's differences and recognizing that those differences may lead to them making choices that we would not make. Sometimes, for example, they make choices based on cultural norms that we can't understand from within our own experience. When we hold space, we release control and we honor differences.
And let's all unmute and say this together in whatever wonderful cacophony we can. When we hold space
for
other people,
we open our
hearts,
offer unconditional support,
and let go of judgment and control.
That's the hard part, I believe. Letting go of judgment and control. So let me just ask you, please stay unmuted if you'd like. What was it like to have those ground rules for hearing these stories? What did it bring any feelings up? What did it feel like to you?
It's very hard not to respond. It was difficult to go by the rules. You have to learn a little self-control.
Why do you think it was hard, Cheryl?
My initial reaction is always to first check in, make sure I understand what's being said, and then start coming to the rescue, you know? So, so holding space that's new for me. It's new. Yeah.
I think we're socialized to listen to respond, not to understand. Any other responses? Yeah, Joy?
I found it wasn't difficult to do that, but I found myself in the silence afterwards re-experiencing this experience, which was over 20 years ago, just in the telling. So, and it was different saying it, knowing that it was for this purpose, and no one would respond at all for a time, was a different feeling that let my experience come off. And I was thinking how grateful I was for the pause.
We want to hear an answer to this particular question from each of you, if you're willing to answer.
I didn't share anything, story, but this whole experience brought me back to being still and listening. I did grief counseling for 10 years, and this is the type of listening that we learn to do. And over the years, you revert back to some old practices, and so this was just so moving. First of all, it was moving to hear the stories that you told, and to hold those without needing to respond, without needing to say something to fix it. And that was the gift that I received when I was doing grief counseling. And that's the gift that you gave me tonight. So that I could just hold that for you, and with you.
I have a thought, which was that I feel that I'm often the person listening to the story and not the person telling the story. And so having a space of 3 to 5 minutes with you will tell a story, made me think, how do I share my story? I'm not used to sharing the story. So it's good. It's a good practice, I think. Maybe even just writing a story down to share it with myself. But, making sure that I have a voice and that I use my voice, and that my story, tells people a little bit more about where I'm coming from, so that they understand more, when we're having a conversation, where I'm coming from.
Barbara, would you like to tell the rest of your story after you share what it felt like?
Okay. Well, I found myself replaying in the silence, replaying what the person had said and trying to feel in my body how that would feel to be in that kind of situation. And that was good. So yes, I can tell you what I did in that situation where that man was so incredibly unhappy. I said to him, you know, I'm not an expert on this, but I have heard that it's possible to expunge your record. And he said, oh yes, I've looked into that. You know, I just have 3 more months on parole and then I'll be able to expunge my record. And I thought, that's pretty good. His phone rang. He had a cell phone with him, and his phone rang, and it was a place. It was one of the homeless shelters. It told him he had a bed for the night, and so that lifted up his spirits too. He said, "I have a bed for tonight," and I just smiled. I was happy for him. And then he started telling me about some woman that met at a party, and maybe she'd like to meet him again and stuff. And it was like, then he got up and left, you know. I never saw him before or after. And I was just thinking how different his whole demeanor was from when he first sat down, and he had been so desperately unhappy. And what did I do? I was just there listening, and just with a little bit of a prompt, he was able to get into a better frame of mind. So I think it worked out pretty well.
You gave him the most important gift that you can ever give anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
That's your time.
Mm-hmm.
He gave us a gift, or at least, go ahead.
Yes, I've learned in my ministry, not only in Sidewalk Talk, but my ministry in general, that a person's presence is a sacred gift. And just to be there with someone is sacred, especially when you're not saying anything and not giving judgment.
Amen. Bev, you said something that struck with me. In each of the stories, we may not know that each of us are the story carriers of such stories until we actually have the opportunity to hear those stories.
Mm-hmm.
We may not know half of what the Jewish community goes through experiencing anti-Semitism, because we haven't created a place where they feel safe sharing, or our culture is not a safe place for sharing that yet, or we haven't created the container where we can hear those stories. And yet each of us suffers in some different way. Or we know the suffering of others close enough that it touches on whatever suffering we've experienced in the past. So let's think back to that video of Thich Nhat Hanh and Oprah. I always think of Orpah. She was actually named Orpah after the character in the book of Ruth, and she could never pronounce it, so she went by Oprah. And so she's a biblical person herself, but she always gets these great interviews with people like Thich Nhat Hanh. What jumped out at you from that video with Thich Nhat Hanh when he was much, much healthier and younger?
I'll just say I noticed that that Oprah was just doing some great listening herself. She did not interrupt, and she had, her questions, and he spoke, and she let him speak his piece.
That's a good model even for an interviewer. Yeah. For some, that's a different cosmology, with the view that we should be more concerned of other people's suffering than our own. Joy?
I was going to say that she was quiet but obviously attentive. So her body posture was conveyed a look of attention, and it was careful that she didn't interrupt with movement or anything else. She kept a welcoming expression on her face and an open body posture.
When I first watched that video, it was the first time I'd heard of listening as a response to terrorism. But it felt right. That folks that resort to violence are ultimately unheard. Maybe not all, but maybe some. That might work. And the other story with Tali, good friend, the story of her and her mother. I thought that was going to be a story about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and there's some other really great videos that are introductions to compassionate listening as a project that are done in Israel-Palestine, and I really encourage you to look them up online. There, you can look up Compassionate Listening Project, but if you look it up in Israel and Palestine, you'll find some powerful videos as well that we didn't have time to share tonight. But what about her and her relationship with her mom stood out for you?
I think her mother didn't really believe that this was going to work and was very skeptical and just sort of, went in it with all of, the bitterness and the negativeness. And when she found out that Tali wasn't going to react, then that's what made her soften her tone. And you really are going to listen, aren't you?
It reminded me that of something that I've come to understand better, that when we're angry, when I'm angry, when I experience anger or someone else's anger, there's another emotion that will appear after the anger is allowed to be expressed and removed. And my most common experience of that is when I go walking because I'm frustrated and I have the conversation while I'm moving. And by the time I get home, a mile and a half later, I've usually come to a point where I can say, yeah, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I knew that when I walked out the door, but I had to walk and talk it out, even if there's no words said. So I was thinking of that because Tali mentioned that her mother then became sad.
And it's okay to feel the feelings that we have and let them pass through us and recognize them and accept the wisdom that they give us at the moment. Or we never get through the grief if we don't really express it, right? What else jumped out at you from that story?
I could, when the mother was talking about Ari dying and, that the Palestinians were to blame, and you could hear that anger, and you could hear the deep grief behind the anger too. Yeah, and I think that's what Tali did later, after she was married, and she was able to listen to her mother, and often it's thoughts that come up for me is we get caught up in our own emotions, and it's good to feel it and sometimes express it. and then let it sink in deeper, and the gift that somebody who listens without judging, without saying anything, is to let that person experience it. You mentioned before about being a container, and that's how I see listening. The deep listening is that you're a container for whatever that person needs to say and experience. As I said, this has been very touching for me personally, because it's gotten me back into a place that I had left, or neglected, let's put it that way, neglected for a while.
I wanted to share that I was reflecting on that Tali was talking about her friend who died when she was young, and that the friend was a Palestinian family, and that when the mother, when anyone lashes out at an entire community, I was thinking about my story that I shared, and when there's a comment made about Jewish people, I know they don't know me, but I feel like since I am in that group, then it affects me in some way, whether it's a lot that day or a little bit. But it reminded me that people do that. They just will lash out at an entire community without really knowing the people. Like Tali knew her friend, and then Tali met her husband and really knew the people and could relate to them, on a personal level. So I was thinking about that.
One thing that Tali says in that video jumps out at me almost every time I watch it, that she set this new boundary with her mother that she would listen to her, and she had in the back of her mind that she was going to listen as long as it took for her to earn the right for her mother to be able to listen to her. And it took months to years. And depending on the relationship that we have and how much trust is there or not, there are probably folks we probably need to invest a lot more time in to earn the right to be able to tell our own stories. Sometimes that might be a more helpful way. Sometimes maybe not, but it might be helpful for some of us to think of some of those deeper conversations we need to have with loved ones that we don't feel like we're ready yet. So, Compassionate Listening Project. These are deep interfaith skills. When we come together as the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County, we love to be in a big round circle so we can see each other. It's hard to do in Zoom when we don't all fit on the same Zoom page. We miss that being in person, and we miss being able to hear each other in that way. And maybe we need to invest more time in creating structures and relationships and organizations that continue to help us go deeper in those relationships. And so continue to practice these skills. You've learned a lot of different skills, from nonviolent communication to some suggestions on responding or not responding, and that not responding is a response, and that sometimes our best response is being silent or listening, and sometimes our best response are questions of clarification, and maybe those should always be our first questions when we do get the opportunity to reopen conversation. Is there any questions you have of each other and each other's stories that were shared tonight?
Let me tell the end to my story. I was greatly relieved when my colleague, when I caught her attention and indicated there was somebody coming up behind us, turned around, looked at him, read his lips, and he was very annoyed that she had not moved out of his way. And she simply looked at him, signed, "I'm deaf," as she said, "I'm deaf." The look on his face was priceless. I don't think I'd ever seen him struck speechless. And I spent quite a while afterwards trying to explain to her that it's not possible to tell that someone is deaf when they're coming up behind or sideways. She looked like a young woman. And she kept saying, "But I'm deaf." And I said, "First, you are you. Deaf is one of your attributes. It is not the thing people see first." And I go back to that experience over and over as the invisible disability and the assumptions we make because we do not have the ability to see or it's not obvious. So it did not seem like a big thing at the time. It was just one of many things. But as I've thought about it over the last 20 plus years, it has become something that I realize I knew something even then.
Cheryl, I'm not sure that I would have done anything differently than you in that situation. And I'm not saying that to fix it or anything, but just to share a moment of solidarity. And I became a pacifist when I became a Protestant. And I do try to notice those little things in the people around me, cues for their subcultures that might help me understand who they are. And that's one that I just don't get.
It's interesting. You called yourself a pacifist, and right away in my mind I thought, but I'm an activist. So I'm an activist. It's my job to fix it, you know. So yeah, I have to learn. This whole experience is really, really good for me because it's causing me to have to blend different kinds of ways of approaching things, and that you don't always have to fix it, respond, make sure that that man knows that what he's doing is bad, you know, all that stuff. You need to kind of sit with it and sort of trust it, that maybe it's better for you to not react. Sometimes the reaction could cause something worse. So yeah, I'm just taking it all in. I'm trying to blend it into who I am, and I really, really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you for being vulnerable with us and sharing that story.
Thank you.
We're almost out of time. So are there closing words that any of you would like to share about this experience tonight, or the three programs that we've put together for congregations, both in our council, in the Tri-City Interfaith Council, or anyone that wants to use them? These will be on YouTube in perpetuity, so hopefully folks will be able to use them to learn new interfaith skills and peacemaking.
I think it's a great resource, and hopefully we will be able to engage groups in person in a number of settings, and this can be a supporting resource to support those conversations. I think this is a great beginning and something that I'll go back to. I don't trust myself to even have the nerve to say I'll be able to use any of these effectively until I've practiced more.
Hi, this is Carol next door.
Well, I want to thank you, Will, for telling me about these. I watched the other two videos. I wasn't able to be here present, live with the other two. And it's been very helpful for me to kind of get back into that. And I realize also that I have in some ways been doing that because I do workshops using art for personal and spiritual growth. And that's the kind of thing, that's one of the rules of sharing in the groups, is listening without, making comments or advice or judgments. And this gets me back into it again. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I think you've collected together a lot of very good resources from a number of different sources, that all have to do with being able to really be authentically with someone and help break down the barriers. So I think it'll be a good resource.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. We'll just put up our little closing slide to remind folks that when we do interfaith work, it's about trying to understand folks of different life philosophies and religious systems. And oftentimes, like what we see in books like Holy Envy by Barbara Brown Taylor, we see that when we experience people of a different faith tradition or a different life philosophy, and we start interacting with them, we learn more about our own faith traditions than we often learn about another person's faith tradition. And so this work is so important in a multicultural, pluralistic world that continues to struggle with protecting religious freedom and everyone's rights to believe what they desire, and to be able to be in relationship with each other in ways without coercion. So let us thank each other, and let's thank all of the participants in the 3 different programs that enriched each of us in these recordings as well. Thank you so much. God bless, and have a great evening.